I think we'll just start with a bit of a who's who to clarify. I'm Eilish out of O'Reilly, and I'm a senior user experience designer at Journey Digital.
And I'm Emily Underwood, acting product team lead and UX UI lead at Ryman Healthcare. Journey and Ryman have been working together for the last 2 years, so we're really excited to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing over that time.
Our focus has been on elevating the independent resident experience, one of the many groups that they cater for across their villages in New Zealand and Australia. We have been doing so by improving their sense of freedom, connection and wellness, designing products and processes to enable them to get the most out of village life. Along this journey, we have learnt a lot. It has prompted us to reflect on our design processes and practices, and that's what we want to share with you today. 3 key takeaways for designing for the overlooked user that we'll all eventually become.
So let's start with the importance of building trust through rapport. Independent residents live in our Ryman villages, either in townhouses or apartments. They might still work or volunteer in the community, drive their own cars, and have an active social life outside of the village. But should they choose to, they can also take part in a wide range of activities that Ryman puts on offer for them. Things like trips to wineries or outings to jump off the Sky Tower, ballet classes, or men's carpentry workshops. They can take advantage of the comfort, convenience, and connection of village life, and they have peace of mind that they can move on to a different level of care should their needs change. So think of someone you know who's about 80, a grandparent maybe, and what it might be like trying to design a digital product for them. This is what we've been doing. This is probably the most removed from a user group that we've ever been, us still kind of young, who grew up with technology and couldn't imagine being without our devices. Compared to our residents, many of whom grew up without technology. They only got a smartphone during COVID so that they could use the COVID Tracer app or FaceTime their family members. They grew up using forms of technology that are now largely outdated. Think about entertainment, communication, banking. So much of that is now digital. And many older people feel like this kind of digital way of life has replaced perfectly fine ways of doing things. Often the needs of people in this age group haven't been considered. They feel like their only choice is to get with it or be left behind. And so here we were, coming in to maybe change how their village life operates and trying to digitize things yet again. It wasn't always the warmest welcome. The difference between us and them meant that when we first started the project and went in to speak to them to understand a little bit more about their lives, was that residents couldn't understand what we were doing. Some used the opportunity to get a little bit of help because they thought we were tech support. Many others took one look at us and thought, they're young, they won't get it, they won't listen. They started to feel vulnerable because they thought we were testing them. The normal niceties of going into a research session and saying, we're testing our product or our design here and not you, just wasn't cutting it. So our starting point was to try and bridge the gap between us and them. We had to find a way for them to open up so we could better understand their needs. We wanted to gain their trust and show them that we really cared.
For older people, time is care. It's not what you talk about with your grandma when you ring that matters, but it's the fact that you do every Thursday, that you show up. So along the way, we learnt the benefit of a good yarn. We booked long user testing sessions that allowed us 20, 30 minutes to cover topics that had nothing to do with our agendas. We talked about Jacinda, COVID, gardening, baking, the vaccine, some of which should probably be avoided at most dinner parties. We went off on tangents and didn't attempt to reel our residents back in. Believe it or not, listening to Barry tell me about how important it is for the lawn bowls green to be even was important. Going off topic and off our task and agenda were okay. It told us that our vulnerable audience was opening up, they were letting us in and feeling comfortable enough to tell their stories. Being less rigid allowed us to navigate some pretty tricky territory. We had to balance not overestimating nor underestimating our audience. Place too early on in the chat the question of, do you know what this is or have you seen this before, in regards to a push notification, could either get a confused and intimidated response from a resident, or a scoff at how ignorant we were for thinking that older people have never seen a phone. Reading the room and adjusting on the fly were important. By reordering our tasks and questions to flow with conversation, it allowed us to be far less clinical and a lot more natural. I think as designers, we need to be careful to not get caught up in the fear of being biased and forget to be human. We're here to get to know our audience and not perform science experiments.
Only genuine attention can help build this kind of rapport. It takes time and there are no shortcuts. You might be a highly qualified UX designer or researcher, up to date with the most recent methodologies, but if you're more focused on the method than the purpose, you might end up rushing through your script and lose them along the way. You'll come across as somebody who feels that who thinks that they know better, who isn't listening, and which for vulnerable audiences is often all too familiar. This is why it's important to start by building trust through rapport.
Next up, we'll be talking about going beyond the interface. For this project, we had a really nerdy interface design challenge on our hands. Part one was about navigating the intricacies of AAA. We wanted to design something that wasn't a symbol of fragility just because the contrast was higher or the type was bigger. We really didn't want a massive "I'm old" sticker. Part two was designing for an incredibly varied exposure to patterns, which, as UX designers, we rely upon. A lot of the tools in our toolkit were gone. We got genuine questions such as, what's an app? What's an Android? Is it a robot? What's a device? Which, for someone who's never seen technology, is all pretty fair. I think sometimes we forget that the patterns that are, so intuitive to us are only so because they're familiar, because we've seen them so many times. But for people who are brand new to the internet or technology, this can all be really baffling. Everything was up for grabs. I've never had to think of what icon to use to represent location, but the very blank stares we put up when the pin icon came up told us that we might have to. We took nothing as given and validated everything from the ground up. Icon by icon, language, scrolling, everything. We wanted to test what was logical, not just what was familiar. We often tried more physical or analog ways of organising information to try and adhere to our audience. After the design phase, we moved into piloting. We sat down with a small group of residents on a weekly basis to learn and get their feedback. We were nervous, but really excited. I think there's always a bit of pride on the line in these places. Did we do a good job of the interface that we'd spent months and months designing? And ironically, the feedback was not about the interface at all. The AAA intuitive design only got us table stakes. Yes, it was simple, but so it should be. That didn't make it valuable. It just made it not a terrible experience.
We realised it was the content. Oh, sorry, not Margaret yet. We realised it was the content that was letting us down. Our pilot group were getting frustrated that things like activities, timings, descriptions weren't correct, or that information about the pool closure wasn't being put into the app. During the pilot phase, it was the activities team's responsibility to add content into the app, but they were juggling both the old and the new system. And they often couldn't get around to updating the content for this small pilot group. But we knew that moving forwards, residents were going to have to rely on this app to plan their days. For example, if the timing for a bus trip to the local supermarket wasn't correct, then Margaret might miss her opportunity to go to the shops and do her own groceries, something she enjoyed and kept her independent, and that was what we were trying to encourage. So if the introduction of the app made the village team's lives harder and made residents feel like they couldn't trust the information in it, this just wasn't going to work. So we shifted focus. We invested more resources and energy into the design of the admin portal. It's the CMS that populates the app. We reduced the load on staff and minimized the effort it takes to create the content. Ultimately, we were competing with paper processes, printouts, and flyers. If it was going to be easier for our team members to revert back to those, then the whole app would fail. We needed to really simplify the processes for both our residents and the team. It made it clear to us that usability testing might show that your app or your product is usable, but that doesn't mean it will actually be used. The information going into residents' hands also needed to be useful and accurate. They needed to know that they could rely on it. In our case, we had to ensure that our incredible village teams, who were critical to the success of the app, were also prioritized. Only this would allow us to impact the overall resident experience.
At the end of the day, Margaret won't remember the highly legible button or the location icon that I spent hours making. It will allow her to use the app, but it won't be what impacts her experience. The app we designed is a small part in something much larger. It's about her looking through activities and getting excited about her month, about her not feeling nervous that her dietary requirements won't be catered for. It's about her sipping her wine and eating her salmon and having a great time with her mates. And if we focus on that and elevating that, then we will be on the right track. I think we need to make sure as designers that we don't get caught up in ourselves and what challenges us and what makes us tick in favour of what has real impact for our users. It's easier than you think. We could have very easily be swept up in the exciting, designing for 80-year-olds, AAA, how do you do all of that? But if we had forgotten about the admin portal and the staff that were so key to facilitating the experience we wanted to impact, we would have never have got there. It would have never made it off the page and into people's lives. We often need to look broader to create transformational change.
And that's what we mean by going beyond the interface and the importance of looking at the wider system that it sits in. So let's now take it a step further and talk about solving the whole or the bigger problem. When we started talking to residents about an app that could help them manage their village lives, we got quite the range of reactions. Some really embraced the idea of change, others not so much. We never kid ourselves that all residents would choose to get the app. It's unrealistic if you think about our current demographic. Although we know our audience will become more tech-savvy as the overall population ages. But it was important for us to make sure that the barrier to entry was as low as possible. We wanted the app to be easy enough for novices to use, but also engaging for those who were tech-savvy. So if anyone wanted to give it a go, they could. But giving it a go was going to take a little bit of encouragement for some. Like we said earlier, this audience is wary. Those who haven't embraced digital tools might resent being designed out of society. They might feel like technology isn't for them because it's a young person's game. They might think, if I'm going to fail, why bother? At my age, I might as well save myself the embarrassment. But through really getting to know them and building up that rapport, we realized a large part of that resistance was actually a lack of confidence. They often knew how to do it, just weren't comfortable enough to do it on their own. So we needed to help build that up. As we saw with our usability testing, though, there was often instant dismissal of what we were saying because we weren't them. So when we launched at villages, we roped in their peers, residents who had also been less confident about the app, but then became app champions, to record their experiences and share their stories. Here's a little snippet of Margaret.
Initially, I thought, what a great idea. And I still think it's a great idea because it reminds us of what's coming up for the week, and it reminds us on the day, and it even reminds us how to have people ahead. It's really clever. You can't be nervous because you can't do anything wrong with it. When you're learning things, you do have to fiddle with it. But you can't delete it. I don't think you can.
Further to this, we sat down with every resident to onboard them. One-to-one, face-to-face, again, taking that time, building their trust and easing them into a largely unfamiliar environment. And it paid off. We initially had the target of 40% uptake in our villages, and I'm stoked to say that we are sitting at around 60%. 60% means that we have been successful in lowering that barrier to entry, that those who are largely unfamiliar with technology are feeling comfortable enough to give it a go, which is amazing. But not Superman either, and we can't lower that barrier to entry to below someone who has a phone. So what happens to them? This was a really large fear. It came up again and again in interviews and user testing sessions from staff, but also from residents. Often the most savvy ones, they were really concerned about what was going to happen to their neighbours. It was really cool to have an audience show you how to be truly inclusive. We found ourselves constantly reassuring them that we wanted to do the opposite of what they were used to. We didn't want to design them out of a community or out of their experience.
Instead of taking away the current manual paper-based processes that they were familiar with, we opted to position the app as a valuable alternative and not a forced replacement. The admin portal was key here. We utilised the database of information that was that built or powered the whole app to also generate physical outputs like a printed calendar. This allowed residents who don't have the app to also get the same information and be kept in the loop. And it also meant that the staff didn't have to keep populating 2 different formats. We knew that better access to village information would lead to the residents feeling more connected, which would in turn help retain their sense of independence. And this was our overall goal, not just to build an app.
If we want to be inclusive, we need to consider the idea that one solution just might not fit all. Our 60% uptake doesn't mean that the app wasn't simple or wasn't well designed. I think sometimes we overestimate what good interface design can do, especially in an audience like ours. For us, it meant that we needed to look broader, consider a range of approaches to solve the whole problem. To wrap up, we know that to design, we must understand our audience. When doing so, for typically overlooked users, we need to invest significant time into building rapport. This trust will allow us a deeper understanding that we can design from. Our focus as designers should be less about the components and the interfaces we design, but broader to the experiences that truly impact our users. We need to pull ourselves out of those details that we are all so passionate about in order to transform the experience. And that transformation might not be entirely digital either. It could be a group of solutions and processes that together allow us to solve the problems of our users. This should always be our focus.
These learnings might be applicable to older people, but they might also work for other overlooked user groups. Think about the next billion users who are coming online now from developing countries. Like our residents, they might not be familiar with technology and are only just getting up to speed. Or those with different access needs who might be overlooked because they are a minority. We really need to adapt our design and research processes to make sure that these voices are also heard.
We need to remember that best practices and guidelines are just that. They aren't the law, and we don't need to be a stickler for the rules. If we prioritise understanding and experience first and design our processes around that, then we'll create truly transformational change. Thank you very much.
Thank you.